Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Well, good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Lindsay Doran.
Right.
Is it fair to call you a Hollywood potentate?
No, it's very unfair to call me that. I'm a Hollywood producer, and there are very few producers who fit as a potentate.
Is that right? But
yeah.
you could also describe yourself as a Hollywood executive. I mean, you've had a career. You've done a lot of things. You were president of United Artists for a while, weren't you?
Right, I was.
Well, that sounds like a potentate.
True. That was 20 years ago, though.
Okay,
so
that was during the potentate
I was a
phase.
studio executive. Then I was a producer. Then I ran a studio. Now I'm back to being a producer, and I also do story consulting.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah,
and we're gonna ultimately talk about. I mean, what started this conversation between you and me via email was a TED talk you gave that's about kind of endings to movies,
right?
And the way people often misremember endings to movies and what that says about human nature. The title of the TED talk is "Saving the World versus Kissing the Girl." So we'll get to that. If it's okay with you, I was hoping to engage in a little idle Hollywood chit chat.
Please, of course.
I mean, for starters, and I want to ask you about a little about some of the projects you've been involved in, because you've been involved in different ways in all kinds of things.
Right.
From Spinal Tap, Spinal Tap, right? Early in your career to to Sense and Sensibility, which you were the producer of, right?
Yes.
I mean. So, well, that's a good place to start. So that was nominated for 7 Academy Awards. It won 1. It won Best Screenplay. But so you were sitting there in the audience, I gather, at the Oscars, and if it had won Best Picture, for which it was nominated, you would have been the person to go on stage and...
Yes, I would have been the person to go on stage.
Did you have like a whole freak out prepared? A whole like, oh, I'm so excited thing?
I had a speech prepared because they only give you a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
I had won the Golden Globe a few weeks before that, and I had 60 seconds. So I crafted 60 seconds for that. I think it was even less time for the Oscars because it's the last award of the ceremony. So I think they don't give you very much time.
Right.
So ideally, you write something, you cut it, you rehearse it, and then you pretend like you're so surprised.
Well, you are surprised even though the speech was prepared, right?
Right. But I thought, like, Glenn Close won the Golden Globe the other night for Best Actress, and she did look stunningly surprised.
Yeah.
And she gave the most beautiful speech, and I thought, really, that was off the cuff because, man, it was pretty great for somebody who wasn't prepared to win.
Yeah. There's a whole range of reactions. I mean, sometimes, for my money, they kind of overdo the surprise and exhilaration part, but who am I to criticize? So you won the Golden Globe for Best Picture that year?
Yes, you can see that speech online if you'd like.
Oh, cool. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, so the Academy Awards are not all that far away this year, and in fact, I gather the votes for nominations are all in now, although the nominations have not been released.
Right.
Now, I had heard that there's something like kind of secretive about like who exactly is a member. Like, are you allowed to answer if I ask you, are you a member of the Academy?
Yes, I am allowed to answer, and yes, I am a member.
So you voted?
Yes.
Huh.
But I'm not allowed to say what I voted for. What I did was nominate. I mean, we're in the nomination process now. So I'm one of the people who nominates within certain categories. Like if you're a director, you can nominate within the directing category and the Best Picture category. Mm-hmm. If you're if you write music, you can nominate within the composing category and the Best Picture. As a producer, I only nominate within Best Picture.
I see. And then there will be a whole finalist voting phase that you'll also be part of.
Right.
Okay. And do you have any, leaving aside who you voted for, is there like Hollywood conventional wisdom floating around that the rest of us haven't heard about what are the big favorites?
I don't think so. I mean, I think this is unlike some years where everybody sort of knows in advance. Nobody is really quite sure what's going to happen. Green Book got a lot of awards at the Golden Globes. Black Panther is certainly something that's being talked about a lot.
Yeah.
Bohemian Rhapsody won a big award at the Golden Globes, so maybe that will be part of it. But traditionally, what often happens is that a movie that wins in the best comedy or musical category doesn't get a nomination from the Oscars, which is much discussed every year.
Huh.
And something I'm particularly interested in, because I'm trying to get people to understand that they should stop thinking of comedies as a lesser thing than dramas. That TED Talk you saw is part of a longer talk I give, and a lot of it has to do with why do we undervalue positive emotions?
Yeah.
Why is it if a comedy gets a 97 on Rotten Tomatoes, which is the aggregate of the critics, and a very depressing movie gets a 97, everybody will vote for the very depressing movie because they think that's higher art automatically. And I'm trying to get people to question that assumption.
Huh.
And to say maybe that has something to do with evolutionary psychology. Frankly, I really do talk about that. That I talk about maybe that the history of storytelling begins with, if we went, when we went out this morning, those of us who went left were eaten by a tiger, and those of us who went right were not. So maybe tomorrow we should go over there. That's the whole beginnings of storytelling. Eat the blueberries and not the red berries. So I think we may still be focused on that, trying to save our lives.
You can certainly imagine various ways telling stories would have actually had implications for our genes, including
Right.
kind of rival accounts of like what happened when you're trying to decide like who's to blame for stuff. Like, here's the way I remember. And that matters. I mean, the allocation of blame is like a consequential thing in terms of, when people are trying to figure out who's in the right and who deserves recompense and so on. And I mean, but certainly storytelling does seem pretty deeply ingrained in the human psyche and
right. And I would think humor is as well, although I don't know what the evidence is of that.
well, I think everybody thinks it is, but I don't think there's a single good theory about why. And I think one theory, as with a lot of things, is that there's more than one correct theory. In other words, humor has more than one function. I mean, sometimes it's part of derision. It's part of identifying someone as the victim of stigmatization. Everyone laughs at the person. Sometimes
Right.
there's not a victim, and it seems to have a purely bonding effect. I'm not aware of a really good theory or a theory that's the consensus favorite.
Right.
So just a little more Hollywood chit chat. I mean, I'm not really well positioned to ask many questions about the Oscars because I don't see that many movies, or at least haven't been late. I did see Black Panther.
Mm-hmm.
It was very good.
Yeah.
And it certainly wasn't so radical that it can't be embraced by the establishment.
Right.
It's liberal enough to be embraced by Hollywood, not so radical that it can't be. I kind of thought the message was, message to African Americans: we understand your anger, but there's such thing as being too angry. You'll die if you're too angry. So better to chart a middle path and kind of join the establishment, join the liberal establishment. Maybe that's an overly cynical reading of it, but that's all I saw. Anything else you want to say about this year's crop? Any films you just loved or anything?
Oh, I loved a lot of movies this year. I thought it was a really good year. I did like Black Panther. I really like Black Klansman. I really like The Hate U Give, which is a movie that isn't talked about a lot, but that I thought was really a valuable movie. It's terrible when you hear about a movie and you hear it's important and you hear it should be shown in every school. You automatically say, why would I want to watch something? It's like eating your spinach. But I thought it was a terrific movie and very entertaining and really, really good. So there's those kind of movies. But I was... I'm in my position as story consultant. I've been consulting on the animated Spider-Man movie, which is also, I think, a really terrific movie, and that's gotten a lot of attention as well. It's been winning all the animation awards. So it's been a good year in every direction. There are little movies. There was a movie called Searching that I really love that not very many people have seen, that I really, really loved, about a father searching for his daughter. I just thought there were good movies across the board this year.
Are they using the same theme song they used for the Saturday morning animated Spider-Man?
It actually does come up at one point. At least it's a very when Spider-Man is essentially talking to the audience, he says he has a really cool theme, and they play.
Huh. So, final chit chat question: you were actually involved in Spinal Tap?
Yes, absolutely.
Spinal Tap. You were like on the set?
Yes, I was.
What was the atmosphere like?
Frantic, because we didn't have a lot of time. I was the studio executive. I had heard that Rob Reiner was trying to get a movie made that was a parody of a rock and roll documentary. And I thought that was a great idea for a movie. I loved rock and roll documentaries, but I could see immediately how you could make fun of them. And so I went to a screening of a little 20-minute version that they had made to prove that they could do it, because they're American, so they had to prove that they could sound English. They had to prove that they could look like rock stars. They had to prove they could sing. They had to prove that they could write songs. And they had to prove that they could be funny without a script. There was no script for this, A Spinal Tap. It was all improvised.
I was going to ask how much improvisation, and there was a whole lot?
Yeah, it was all improvised. There was an outline of scenes, and the outline would just say, in this scene, they find out that the album has been pulled because the cover, and then the woman playing Bobby Fleckman was told what the cover was. But all the dialogue was improvised. Or in this scene, the manager quits, and then all the dialogue was improvised. So it was only situations, and then everything else was done from scratch. It was a very weird way to make a movie, and something that made the studio, as you can imagine, very nervous, because how do you budget that? How do you schedule that? So nobody had enough time, but I loved that movie, and I loved it all the way through. It did not do well in the theaters. There was very little marketing done.
Really?
It felt like a movie that was going to completely die because there was no home video then. And then all of a sudden home video happened, and it became this movie that virtually everybody's seen and can quote from a movie that did very, very little box office.
Like for example, this one goes to 11.
Absolutely. This one goes to 11. And there's so many things. And it's just so interesting that a movie that really had almost no theatrical release is so well known now.
Well, that's a real thing now. I mean, you kind of like... I know, like Vanilla Sky, for example. I don't think that has a huge following, but it was kind of didn't do that well in the theaters, and it acquired something of a following. This kind of thing just happens a lot.
Yes, it does happen a lot, and you hope that it happens. It's nice when a movie does well in the theaters. That's great. But now, fortunately, there are so many ways to see movies and so many times that you can look at them. When my father was in the movie business, and I was born very late in his life, so he was making movies at a time when there were no movies on TV, there was no home video, there were no film festivals, there wasn't anything. So he, for example, was the executive on Sunset Boulevard.
Wow!
And when Sunset Boulevard didn't do well at the box office, they thought that was it. They didn't think anybody would.
So that did not do well at the box office?
No, it didn't.
And now it's a complete classic.
Now it's a complete classic. And, cut 2 years later, I introduced him to my boyfriend who became my husband, and his favorite movie ever was Sunset Boulevard. It would just sort of come full circle. But there was...
John, because it was made long before you could, you had a VCR or anything, right?
Right.
When did
it was made before there were movies on television in any sense. So it's for television probably, or just the very beginning. So there was a period. What I try to make filmmakers understand now is that even if the movie doesn't do well at the box office, how lucky we are that there is a long life for these things. And, in the genre noir, died before he had any idea that some of his films were going to become these classics that everybody studied. And Martin Scorsese talks about Rules of the Game as being the greatest movie ever made. Well, I think Renoir died before he had any idea that that's what was going to happen. So there is this sense that we're lucky to live in a time when, even if it's not in our lifetime, there is a hope that things can be discovered later.
Yeah. I mean, I would think at the same time, this new landscape that gives everything the opportunity of a second life is kind of a challenge for Hollywood, right? Because there's now so much competition for the eyeballs. And I guess what Hollywood could do is just say, yeah, okay, well, we do it all. We do, and they are saying that maybe. I mean, right? We do Netflix, we do Amazon, we do theatrical release. So I guess on balance, it's good news.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's odd. It used to be when somebody came to Hollywood, if you said, gee, maybe you should be writing television, that would be an insult. Now people come to Hollywood hoping they're going to write television. I mean, there are certain people who love movies and only want to write movies. But what people are really watching with tremendous excitement right now are series on Netflix, series on Amazon, series on HBO. There's such amazingly good writing going on television that it's a very, very respectable thing to be doing right now. And there have been a few movies in the last couple of years that were made as theatrical features that at the last second ended up on Netflix. Even when there was already a trailer in the theater saying this movie is coming to this theater in 3 weeks, all of a sudden it never comes to that theater. It shows up on Netflix. So people are just trying to evaluate where is the best place for this movie to get seen. Is it going to compete in the marketplace against other theatrical movies, or would it be better off as a Netflix movie? And Netflix makes that quite competitive financially.
Okay, well, let's get into the subject of your TED Talk and this question of the way movies end. You can kind of launch into it any way you want. I mean, including like how the whole question came to your attention. I think you mentioned positive psychology already. That you're interested in that is related.
Right. It's completely related. When I met you at that conference at the Graveside Manor in England.
Yeah, we should say you and I met at a conference convened by Marty Seligman, who is sometimes called the founder of positive psychology, certainly one of them.
Right.
Right. And that is the beginning of that's our origin story.
That's our origin story, exactly, like Spider-Man. I went to that conference. I had never met Marty before or any of you people before, but I had written him a letter I had called him up actually years before when he wrote Learned Optimism, and we had a really interesting conversation with him. And for various reasons, all those years later, he asked me to that conference. And so I began learning more about positive psychology, and I learned specifically about the 5 elements of well-being: positive emotions, engagement, positive accomplishments, positive relationships, and meaning. And when I saw that list, I thought, well, those are the elements of a good movie. I had been asked to speak at the Second World Congress of the International Positive Psychology Association, and I thought maybe I could speak about that. I could find a correlation. And so I began doing interviews with people to sort of ask them about things. And I talked to somebody who does market research in the movies, and he looked at the list and he said, well, the first thing I can tell you is that audiences don't care about accomplishments. And that was such a stunning statement to me, because I think everybody in Hollywood thinks that's what we're doing. What does the character want?
In the sense of what? What kinds of accomplishments are you thinking they do value?
Well, I thought they valued all of them. But what he was saying is, don't be fooled into thinking that that's what they value most. What they value most is the moment afterwards, when the accomplishment is shared with the person the hero loves. And what he was trying to say was, don't end your movie on the accomplishment. It will leave the audience unsatisfied. What matters is not saving the world, but who are we saving the world for? What was the point? What was the human point of all that? And so after I talked to him, I began to notice that the movies that I thought of as ending in accomplishments, and the ones that I talk about in my TED Talk, are The King's Speech and The Karate Kid and Dirty Dancing. They don't. They end with reconciliation scenes. They end up with somebody, the last scene in Dirty Dancing is the father saying, have he just seen his daughter dance for the very first time and said, you're so beautiful? And, you know what I mean? Or the end of Star Wars, where it's that scene where everybody's getting an award, except the Wookiee, which a lot of people object to. Everybody thought the Wookiee should get a medal. But you see all those looks going back and forth. And R2-D2, we were afraid that R2-D2 had died, and R2-D2 looks great, and there's this lovely moment where Luke looks over at R2-D2 and smiles to see that he's healthy again. And there's so many looks going on there between the princess and Han, and all of it comes down to that. It doesn't come down to blowing up the Death Star. So when I wrote to you, it was like, is there some answer in evolutionary psychology that explains why this would be the fact? Because what happens also, I've learned, is that everybody remembers it differently. People remember the accomplishment ending. they think that Rocky won the fight. Rocky didn't win the fight.
Well, that's a case of actually misremembering the ending.
Misremembering.
I mean, sometimes what they do is they remember the triumph, blowing up the Death Star. They don't remember the social affirmation afterwards, right? Or the king's speech. They remember the triumphant speech, and they don't remember, well, whatever the scene is afterwards. I don't remember it, right? That's your point.
Right. And yet, as filmmakers, what we know.
But in the case of Rocky, they
make it up.
You know what's funny about that is it's actually a fusion of the fight scene and what does happen afterwards. Because what happens afterwards is a happy ending in terms of him and Adrian, right? And them like loving each other, and the fight having been for practical purposes a victory so far as their relationship.
He had said ahead of time, he had said the night before, all I want to do is go the distance. Nobody's ever gone 15 rounds with Apollo Creed. If I could go 15 rounds with Apollo Creed, that's all I have to do. And that's what he does. He goes 15 rounds. He doesn't win the fight, but he did what he set out to do. He has the girl of his dreams. He has his self-respect back. He has the respect of his trainer back. He has all these human things that have worked for him. The victory doesn't matter. So, but it is interesting that, I mean, I was talking to a woman about a movie that she had produced, and she didn't remember that it ended with the relationship. She really did think it ended with the accomplishment. So it's just interesting to me that what we've learned is that audiences need that. Because I've seen now a couple of movies that don't end with that. And
when you say they need it, you're saying on the one hand, if the movie wants to be commercially successful, it really needs to have the social part after the triumph. On the other hand, that's not what people are going to remember as the ending.
Right, exactly. And it isn't so much commercially successful because commercial success can be dependent on so many factors. Sure. While it's really in the preview process. You know, we put a movie into a theater, we fill it with the people most likely to go, and we ask them what they think. And it almost all comes down to the last 10 seconds of the movie, how they feel when the movie is over. So it's that feeling you're trying to generate. Then that turns into word of mouth, and that ideally turns into commercial success. But it's really just about a satisfying movie. A satisfying ending seems to require a scene about human connection. And it isn't even, I mean, for example, I talked to the man who wrote the play that the King's Speech was based on. You know, the King's Speech ends with a card that says that the two men were friends for the rest of their lives. And I asked the playwright how the play ended, and he said it was the two characters on stage. When everything is done, the speech is over, and the speech therapist says, "Your Majesty," which I think he's never called him before. And the king says to the speech therapist, "My friend." So even there, you know, it comes down to that. And, you know, there are certainly movies where people end up alone, but that's usually a comment on their lack of a relationship. The end of Moneyball, where Brad Pitt is in a car all by himself listening to his daughter sing a song about what a jerk he is. Or the end of Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, where she's all ready to finally form a relationship again, and then she's betrayed, and so she's alone. It's all about you can make a scene that's about the lack of a relationship, but there has to be some sense of what it means to be alone in terms of what that says about your life. Or Social Network, where he's sitting there trying desperately to friend the girl and not getting a response. He may be alone, but it's all about a relationship.
Yeah. Now, when you ask me why did I think this was that people would misremember the triumph as the actual end of the movie, I mean, I don't have a good answer. I mean, the first thing I said was there's a lot of evidence that intensity of feeling is associated with strength of memory. Right. And certainly, triumph is a strong feeling emotion. Right. On the other hand, like the reason that intensity of emotion, that an evolutionary psychologist would speculate intensity of emotion is correlated with memory, is that, emotions are signifiers of value kind of in Darwinian terms. I mean, the things we care most about, the things that exhilarate us most, depress us most, in a general way, you could say, have something to do with the things that were good for our genes, bad for our genes, in the environment of our evolution. And so, but on the other hand, social relationships were very important, and that's why they're valued. And that's why I'm sure at some level, that's why so many movies have that as part of the formula, the post-triumph social affirmation.
Right.
So I don't have a good answer. I mean, I will say that, in my experience, like the distinction between winning in an individual athletic competition and winning in a team sport, it's really qualitatively different. It does feel great to beat someone, especially if you don't like them, like one-on-one. But even just with pickup basketball, there's nothing quite like the feeling of winning together with other people. And I wasn't like a good athlete in high school, but I did have one moment of being the hero in basketball in high school. And there's nothing like it.
Yeah.
So I'm slightly puzzled. One thing I want to, in kind of trying to figure this out, one thing I want to ask you is something that I've heard you allude to, which is that there are ideas in Hollywood about kind of guy flicks and girl flicks, right? And isn't the triumph part, that's more associated with the guy flick and the subsequent social part with the girl flick, or is that too?
Well, I mean, what I felt and what I talk about, I think, in my TED Talk is I was breaking it down as, let's talk about positive accomplishments in terms of the movies, and let's talk about positive relationships in terms of the movies. And what I began to realize was that in movies that are mainly attended by women, the accomplishment tends to be the relationship. That's what we're after.
So the classic romantic comedy, that's really the classic romantic comedy,
the classic romantic drama. It doesn't matter whether it's Sleepless in Seattle or Star is Born. It's that's what you're selling, right? And I mean, Star is Born, there is also an accomplishment, but mainly what you're selling in your trailers and in your TV ads is the relationship. And there's more of an overlap now than there used to be. I think Black Panther was actually 50-50, male and female, in terms of who went. And more, a lot of big action movies are attended a lot by women, depending on what it is. But I mean, a lot of the time you'll see that it was 52% men and 48% women. But movies that are specifically about relationships tend to be the ones that women attend 60% of the audience, 70% of the audience, even 80% of the audience. It just depends. So,
and I would think that that if you're a studio executive, you'd like something to be a good date movie as a rule, right?
You would. What's happened, though, is that I was told that a few years ago, one of the studios did an international study of audiences, trying to find out what they wanted, because movies are very expensive now. So if you're going to spend a lot of money on a movie, you want to make sure it's what the audience wants. And one of the questions was, what's your favorite genre? And the answer overwhelmingly all over the world was sequels. And everybody right away is horrified and goes, wait, that isn't even a genre. When did that happen? And isn't it terrible? And we're all seeing these fifth and sixth and seventh versions of the same movie. But eventually I began to say, well, what's the difference between that and watching season 7 of your favorite miniseries? What is the difference between it doesn't matter whether it's Game of Thrones or The Good Wife. You love those characters. You want to spend more time with them. You want to see what's going on in those relationships. Are those two people ever going to get together? It doesn't really matter. So I think that idea of the continuing story is very, very popular right now. It's very difficult to do a sequel to a love story.
Mm-hmm.
You can do 4 different movies called A Star is Born, but you don't make a movie about what happened the next day. It is the triumph upon which you cannot build. And you can make a bunch of Avengers movies, and you can make a bunch of Spider-Man movies, but once Harry and Sally are together, you don't really want to see that marriage dissolve.
Yeah.
And it can't possibly be better than the moment when they get together. So you don't have sequels. And so investing in a romance right now is not what studios are really doing. And Netflix is sort of moving into that area because they don't care so much about all that.
But could you see this one common pattern of triumph and then social kind of affirmation as in some cases being a way to take what is largely a guy movie and make it palatable too. And like, I'm not necessarily embracing these abject stereotypes, but if this is the way studio executives think, let's play the game. Like, could you see that as a way of having it both ways? In other words, if you just ended after they blow up the Death Star,
right,
or whatever, then it's going to be harder for the guy to sell it to the girl.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I did have more than once when I've given this my longer version of the talk, and I do it at studios. You know, I've done it at all the major studios and all the agencies and management companies, and I've given this talk everywhere. And more than once, I've had a young guy in his 20s, come up to me afterwards and saying, I think those love stories ruined all the superhero movies that I've seen. And I don't understand why they're there. And I said, well, why do you think they're there? And they said, well, I guess it's because, you know, that'll stop ringing in a second. If some woman wandered in by mistake, there'd be something there for her. Mm-hmm. But more and more, I think men are beginning to appreciate the love stories that are part of action movies, and they're being well written a lot of the time. There's some really good relationship stuff going on, and it doesn't matter whether it's between the men and the men, or the men and women, or women and women. They're just really interesting relations. So the love story in Wonder Woman, for example, is a terrific love story. It's really, really a good love story. One of my favorite love stories of the year. It happened to be in Wonder Woman. So I think, yes, it would be nice to think that all Hollywood studio people are thinking about is, we can get in the girls if we do that. But I think writers like to be able to make the whole movie. There isn't, and I think this has something to do with, in my mind, a not positive outcome of feminism, is that love stories are kind of going away in movies for kids. More and more animated movies don't have love stories.
Really?
No, they don't. They have a central relationship, which is often between a man and a woman.
But it's more collegial, or
it's collegial, exactly. Moana or Zootopia, or it's collegial as opposed to a love story. I think that's too bad. I love love stories, and I think they make everything richer. But it's easier. You still need that romantic comedy. You know, the two characters in Zootopia have a tremendously Harry and Sally relationship, because it's the cynic and the optimist, and that nothing is better than that combination. Mm-hmm. But one's a fox and one's a rabbit. I don't think that's going to work out. So it's there are a lot of love stories that are kind of going away, but there are still often really good love stories in big action movies, and it does really help. I mean, you know, Titanic is still this giant movie. You know, Titanic and Avatar are these huge movies, sort of untouched, and they have love stories in them. Titanic is a love story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It happens to be about a ship that goes down, but it is a great love story. And look, you know, it's still one of the most successful movies of all time after 20-some years.
Yeah, I have to admit, I've only seen it on an airplane, and I didn't pay for the headphones. But I got the general idea. The boat goes down, right? The ship goes down.
Ship goes down. They don't end up together.
Yeah. But what is it that salvages that unhappy ending from a commercial point of view? I mean, obviously there is a romance. But since I didn't see it, what exactly is it about? I mean, did they both die?
No.
Oh, they didn't.
I can't believe it. No, Leonardo DiCaprio dies. And he says to Kate Winslet how important it is that she live. Uh-huh. And she takes action to make sure that she takes a whistle and blows it, and she's saved. And there's a line towards the end of the movie in which she says, he saved me in every way that it's possible for a person to be saved. And I have a whole theory about how every movie is about saving. But what happens is that movie is framed by the Kate Winslet character as an old woman. So you always know that she survived. And you see evidence of this incredibly rich life that she had, that Leonardo DiCaprio allowed her to have. So he's a great character. She's a great character. He's aspirational. She's aspirational. You know, it's the rich girl and the poor boy. It hits all kinds of things. But, you know, I ran Sidney Pollack's company for years, the famous Hollywood director, Mirage, yes. And he his entire career did nothing but love stories that ended unhappily.
What are some of the better known ones?
Out of Africa is the one that won the Oscar, is one of the famous ones. Electric Horseman is one of them. 3 Days of the Condor is one of them. He just did all these love stories where people didn't end up together. Havana was one of the last ones that he did. And when people would say to him, why do you do these love stories where people don't end up together? He would say, name me a great love story where they do. The great love stories are Romeo and Juliet. They're not, it's the obstacle. And it's this notion, it's in a Dylan Thomas poem, I think, about though lovers be lost, but love survives. And I think that notion that the love is still there when the people can't be together is very, very strong. And for some reason, very, very satisfying.
And what's your theory about, say, all movies being about saving?
Well, I just began to notice at one point, I mean, obviously superhero movies tend to be about saving. You're saving the world, you're saving a certain person. Mm-hmm. But I began to think about love stories that way. And as I say, when I think about that line in Titanic about he saved me in every way it's possible for a person to be saved, it's like we do think in a way that Sally saved Harry. And that Harry saved Sally. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot, and that Rocky was saved. You know what I mean? He didn't just be in that fight. Everything that happened, that whole experience saved him. He was on his way down in every way that it's possible for a person to be on their way down.
Right.
And he's saved. So it's an interesting way to think about it. I'm not sure I could go through every movie and talk about it that way, but I just began to realize how often that word was coming up. Mm-hmm. No matter what movie I was talking about. And so it's become an interesting thing just to think about it. I'm not a scientist. It's so interesting when I talk to Marty Seligman or to anybody who's really a scientist. And, when you're a storyteller, you just sort of say stuff. You say stuff like movies are about saving. You don't say, where's the evidence of that? And how many studies have been done? And was there a control? And, you kind of meld your theories with the truth and see how it goes. But I do think it's an interesting way of thinking about things.
Well, it's an interesting question how conscious artists are, and the answer, of course, differs for all of them, but how conscious they are, both of why their art works when it works, in the sense of people liking it or paying attention to it, also in the sense of what they're even meaning to convey, if they're meaning to convey anything. I mean, there's huge variation there. I think some poets, you ask them what they're, and they'll have an answer. This is what I meant. And I think some of them won't. Right. And I'm wondering, in Hollywood, you certainly get the impression that the process as a whole, right? Okay, you got the screenwriter, but that's just the beginning, right? Right. It's got to go through this whole, what from the point of view of some screenwriters seems like a Cuisinart, right? And certainly in the course of that process, very explicit consideration is given to what sells, what doesn't, what makes people happy, and so on. I understand that, but in your experience, if you look at the screenwriters, how aware are, and you've worked very closely. I mean, just to back up, Sense and Sensibility, it's not just that you were the producer. You really created the thing. You took the idea to Emma Thompson, as I understand it. Right. I mean, obviously, you didn't write the novel. You didn't start that early, but you took it to her. She became the writer. It was the first screenplay she wrote, as well as the star.
Right.
So, and I know there are other cases where you've really developed scripts. Well, maybe even Dead Again, which had kind of helped put her on the map, right? Mm-hmm. So, what in your do all screenwriters, can they all give you this analysis about why this works? What part of the formula this hits, or do you distinguish this one is just kind of this one's a true artist? This one is just more of a craftsman, and so on.
I try to only work with people who are both artists and craftsmen. But I mean, I think there are some screenwriters, Michael Arndt, for example, who wrote Little Miss Sunshine and who's been working on the Star Wars movies, and works at Pixar a lot. He's a theorist. And you can go online and you can look at his ideas about beginnings and endings, and he can break down 3 different Pixar movies and how the the openings, he has a thing called Great Beginnings, and he just shows you how it kind of works and what is the moral obstacle and how the character makes the wrong choice. And he loves that. And he's very, very generous with his ideas, saying, take a look at this. Don't just copy the formula, but isn't it interesting that this is how it goes? And isn't it interesting all these endings have so much in common? I work with a lot of writers who, if you'll say, why is this the right line? They'll say, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I just know, because it's not just what the words mean. It's the sound of the words. It's the rhythm of the words. I knew a little bit, not as much as I would like to, the screenwriter Alvin Sargent, who wrote Paper Moon and a lot of great, great movies. And I got to know him a little bit. He's still around. But I had heard that he's a writer who loved writing people and loved writing scenes about people, not so much action or any kind of thriller or any of that stuff. He just loved to have two people in a room having a conversation. And I had heard that on his tombstone, he wanted it to say, "At last, a plot." And Sydney corrected me and said, "No, it's finally a plot." And I went, "You're right. That's so much better." And how do you explain that? Why is it that the certain sound of that word and the certain number of syllables and one word instead of two is just more aesthetically pleasing to me, to him, to Alvin, than the other way? So a lot of the writers that I work with do think that way. They're very good storytellers. Scott Frank, who wrote Dead Again, is a terrific storyteller. Mm-hmm. But it's mysterious. And he wouldn't be able to explain a lot of the time the choices that he made.
You're talking about conversation just reminded me in terms of illustrating how different movies can be. My Dinner with Andre. Mm-hmm. It's just a conversation.
Yeah.
And, it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
It's like it holds your attention.
It's pretty good. So you compare that to Titanic, and they're both movies, and how do they all fit into the same genre?
And in terms of how differently different writers work, if I'm recalling correctly, somebody asked David Lynch how he came up with Blue Velvet. And I think he basically wrote it as well as directed it, probably. But he said, if I'm recalling correctly, he said, well, I just had this image all of a sudden. It just flashed into my consciousness of a severed ear in a front yard in a lawn. And I thought, well, that's one way to start on a plot, then you build from there, right? But he's very imagistically driven.
Right.
And you see that.
Right. When Scott Frank, who wrote Dead Again, later on, he and I were working on a series that was being made for Showtime that we took short stories by the great noir writers, and, Dashiell Hammett and Cornell Woolrich and Raymond Chandler, and turned them into little half-hour shows for Showtime. And Scott was supposed to write one, I think it was called Dead Man. And at the last second, we couldn't get the rights to it. So he said, just find me a story with the word dead in the title. I said, that's all you need? He said, yeah, it just has to have the word dead in the title. So we found the other producer, Bill Horberg, who created the series, found a story called Dead End for Delia. Mm-hmm. And Scott wrote it in a week.
Wow.
Makes no sense. Makes no sense.
Yeah.
It's just art.
Dead Again was a really good movie, by the way. I know you were very involved. It came up very recently in conversation, and we couldn't remember if it was all in black and white or part of it was in color. No, just the flashbacks, just the parts that take place in the 40s are in black and white. Okay.
And that was a decision in post-production, actually. The movie was shot entirely in color.
Really?
Yeah, it was shot entirely in color, but it had been written for 4 actors. And when Kenneth Branagh said, I'm going to play both male leads and I want my wife to play both female leads, that was great, but it was difficult. The audience was having a hard time keeping track of where they were. So if we could just go into black and white, they knew immediately they were in a flashback, and we could come back into color. It was all fun. So that was a decision made then, which was not a popular decision among people like the costumers and the art directors, because they said we would have done this entirely differently if we knew it was going to be in black and white.
Mm-hmm. Now, I ask you one question about screenwriters' kind of state of mind as they write. Another question is how many, and this applies both to screenwriters and directors, maybe more to directors, how many of them would you say are conscious of the impact the movie is going to have? And maybe one subset of that question is how many of them want to make the world a better place with their movies? Want to make people better, inspire people, or teach them morals, teach them valuable lessons, or help, nourish a healthy moral code or whatever. I know.
I would say most of them.
Really?
I would say the vast majority of them. Now, I work a lot in animation now. A lot of the story consulting that I do is in animation. I've worked on more than 40 animated movies. And there it's very much a part of the conversation from the very beginning. Identifying your theme and making sure that that theme is something that you want to get across to the families of the world is a huge part of that. On Sense and Sensibility, we talked a lot about love and money because we felt that the whole book came down to a kind of a dance between love and money. Who marries for love? Who marries for money? How unhappy the people are who marry for money, and yet they can't imagine living without it. And if you go right down to the last image of the movie, it's somebody throwing coins in the air on his wedding day. So it was just something that we were aware of all the way through, and it's in the visual imagery of the movie. It's in the dialogue of the movie. So I would say certainly the people that I've worked with, they're almost always aware of some kind of theme. I mean, Dead Again is a thriller. It's a classic thriller, even though it's a reincarnation thriller. It's a thriller. And I think the theme of that is love never dies. Mm-hmm. Those two people loved each other in the 40s. A terrible thing happened. Now they've found each other in the present, and this time it's going to work out. So it can be as simple as love never dies. But I was working on something this morning where I said, I've identified 4 themes here. And they're all great, but they're all fighting for attention in this script. And it seems to keep kind of changing from scene to scene. So we really should identify one theme and make sure that we're...
What was the nature of the themes? Like one was love or one was romance?
They were more things like... I have to be careful because all of this work I do is anonymous, so I can't specific, but they're everything from, if life hands you lemons, make lemonade to, I'm working, one of the things that I'm hoping to produce soon, the theme is, it's really a question. If you could get away from grief, if you could make sure that your life would never contain grief, and all you'd have to do is forget the people that you love.
Oh, that's heavy.
What would your choice be?
That's pretty heavy for Hollywood, I gotta say.
It's a family movie. It's a talking animal movie.
Oh my gosh.
But that's a big part of what it's about. But one of the directors we were talking to about it said, I think this is a movie about how the most important things in life are the things we overlook. And that's where he tapped into it. And he was absolutely right. That material is all the way through. So I'm very interested in the grief part of it. It's very much like,
I like that a lot.
I like it a lot. It's very much what Eternal Sunshine is about. If you could get away from the grief would we just find our way right back to it again? So these can be very, very heavy themes. I mean, you look at Zootopia is all about bigotry, and people get into very, very deep stuff. Sidney Pollack used to talk about how all of his movies would ask a question, like The Way We Were was one of his most successful movies. And the question was, how are we supposed to live? Are we supposed to just enjoy ourselves the whole time, or should we be fighting for justice the whole time? And he said, what I like to do is ask the question and then fight it out over the course of the movie. And by the end of the movie, I don't know the answer to the question, but I know a lot more about the question. Mm-hmm. And I think, and then other people do movies that say apartheid was bad, and that's what you learn over the course of the movie. So, but these things come up all the time. All the time. I mean, it's a rare movie where there isn't some kind of really serious thought going on.
Sometimes you see it. You can like, I can tell you, I'm blocking on the name of the director who did, Vanilla Sky, Jerry Maguire,
Cameron Crowe. Cameron Crowe.
Cameron Crowe. you really, for my money, you really see it in his. I mean, the moral is sometimes it's like, and sometimes a little too much. Like in Vanilla Sky, the guy says the little things. There's nothing bigger. You know, it's like, okay, I get it. You know, it's like, I mean, that said, I'm a huge fan of his stuff because precisely because, you know, I think it is morally redeeming, or at least that's clearly its aspiration. And yet it's actually by and large, it's not schmaltzy. It's genuinely funny. And sometimes edgy like Vanilla Sky, but so sometimes you can see that very much. Now at the other end of the spectrum, and I guess one question I have is, do people who consider themselves as artists in some kind of pure and perhaps overly dramatic sense tend not to pay attention to the impact? I'm thinking of Quentin Tarantino. You know, it's like his, in one way, I see some of his stuff as a true work of genius, but I really worry that there's something kind of like some of the humor in Pulp Fiction is like, if you're, you know, making people laugh in a scene like that, right, is like, there's just something kind of wrong with that. I mean, maybe I'm old fashioned, but it's just kind of inherently coarsening, or it's like, we shouldn't, do you know what I mean?
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. I do think that, I mean, I think Blue Velvet is another version of somebody who works backwards from sensation. Yeah. Quentin Tarantino works backwards from sensation. He has scenes in his head, and he knows what an impact they're going to have. He knows how suspenseful they're going to be. He knows that you're going to get a laugh that might seem really uncomfortable, and yet everybody's laughing anyway. I mean, he's going for something very, very powerful. Whether he's thinking about the morality underneath it all, I have no idea. I have no idea whether David Lynch is either.
But, you know, I see Quentin Tarantino as darker and almost as more intentionally dark than David Lynch, if that makes sense. I mean, it's like he wants to push the margins every time. Right. Whereas David Lynch, I mean, he's done such a variety. I mean, I think Elephant Man is a wonderful movie. Great movie. And a redeeming movie.
Yes, and he made a lovely movie called The Slow Story. I mean, he made this movie about an old man traveling to see his brother, and he does it on one of those things that's like a lawnmower. He's like all he can do. And everything about it is slow and lyrical and beautiful, and it doesn't sound interesting, and it's so interesting. Yeah. And you'd never know it was a David Lean movie, except that it's visually phenomenal. Yeah. So interesting visually.
Yeah, they're always distinctive. I still haven't forgiven my wife for subjecting me to Eraserhead.
Well, yeah, there we are. There we are. I mean, it is very, very difficult to watch that movie, but you don't forget it. You haven't forgotten it all of this time. So that thing about sensation, it's a very real part of, you know, Chien de Loup, where an eye is cut open. I mean, it's just, what kind of reaction can I get out of this audience? For some filmmakers, that's really all they care about. Storytelling is beside the point. Yeah. Morality is beside the point. You know, there are certain filmmakers who will talk about post-narrative cinema. They honestly think that storytelling is a thing of the past, and they're much more interested in what they call observational cinema. So you're just kind of watching. And I'm a storyteller, so I want suspense and surprise and twists and turns, and I want all of that. So I find it very difficult to watch those movies that have no story, unless they're in another language, and then I'm fine. Figure that out. As long as there's subtitles, some part of my brain says, "Oh, this is fine. You don't need a story." This is Ingmar Bergman.
My wife's a big Bergman fan. I don't always see why. I mean, it's a different era of movie making, and I think it's one of a number of signs that she's just more subtle than I am in some ways. But like, I mean, he did like the Seventh Seal. Is that the one?
Yes.
Oh man.
Wild Strawberries.
Wild Strawberries. She just loves that. So do I and it was good. I mean, it was good. I liked it. I'm not a total Philistine. So your interest in positive psychology, do I take that to mean that you actually do think a lot about the impact of the films you work on and actually want them to have a positive effect?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I do. I want people to think about how how they may be drawn to negative subject matter because they want to win an Academy Award. You hear this all the time. If I'm ever going to win an Oscar, I better make something really depressing. It's weird. So I want people to recognize the value of joy in the theater. I was so happy that so many of the animated Spider-Man reviews use the word joyous. And, bad things happen in that movie. People are killed. It's not that they don't, but there is something about that movie that makes you so happy when you watch it. And when you think about something like Jerry Maguire and how happy that movie is, so full of happiness. Even though it's also full of really, really sad things. It's got a really great happiness at the beginning and great happiness at the end, and you tend to forget all the sad stuff in the middle. So yeah, I think it's very important to have themes that make the world better. I think, I saw a study that said that they could actually measure how prejudice went down in England because of Harry Potter.
Really?
Yeah. And I get it. This is really important to her. She's worked with refugees. She knows how bad that she's worked with torture victims. She knows exactly what's going on. So when she's writing about that in those books, it's a very, very serious thing. So it's easy to talk about theme when you're making movies for families. But I do think that I think it's very important. Very, very important. And I think one of the things that interests me still is this notion that, for example, in my TED Talk, I talk about the end of the King's Speech and how the card says Lionel and Bertie remained friends for the rest of their lives. The end of Green Book, big movie this year, just won the Golden Globe. The two men remained friends for the rest of their lives. The end of The Front Runner, which is about Gary Hart. Gary Hart and his wife remain married to this day. The movie about Oliver Hardy and Stan Laurel ends with something that says even though Oliver Hardy died 14 years before Stan Laurel went on writing Laurel and Hardy skits for the rest of his life. Nobody is sitting down with a formula. Nobody is sitting down and says, well, I heard this thing that we should all end with, relationship stuff. It's just there is this sense, it must sound like everybody's sitting down with a formula, but they're really not. Everybody comes to the same conclusion, which is what really matters is not that these people were friends then, but that it worked out. It doesn't matter what does it say about Gary Hart and what he put his wife through, that they got through it and they're still married. What does it mean with all of the arguing and fights and that went on between Laurel and Hardy, that somehow that love story went on even one of them had died. So it's what you want, it's lovers may die, but love shall not. It's I don't know. I think about this all the time.
Okay, yes, I can tell. And it's good that you do. And we'll direct people to the TED Talk. We'll link to the TED Talk. Okay. They will encounter this conversation in one of several places, either the audio podcast or on YouTube. But the place to go for the actual links to your stuff is meaningoflife.tv. And now,
can I ask you something that I was thinking
absolutely.
About when I was because when I was reading or listening to Why Buddhism is True, one of the things I was trying to figure out, and it has a lot to do with why I think about women and men and what attracts them in movies, is when you talk about the person who's trying to meditate and where their mind goes and how you kind of see how all of those things would have mattered in the tribe. Do you think men's minds and women's minds go different places?
First I would do the standard caveats. I'm talking about, statistical generalizations about two groups. Any given woman may be more like the male norm than some men and so on. With that said, yes, certainly anybody who's an evolutionary psychologist believes that there are at least some psychological differences between the sexes in the aggregate. Most obviously in the realm of sexual psychology, having to do with things like jealousy. And in some realms, it's kind of like it seems that there are these differences, but it's not so obvious what the evolutionary explanation would be. And for that reason, I'm commensurately less inclined to believe that this is necessarily in the genes. Mm-hmm. But certainly some of the things are have very plausible evolutionary explanations, and there's data to believe that they are, kind of in some sense, the inclinations are in some sense located in the genes. That was an overly long answer to your question. The answer is yes. The answer is yes.
Because we don't want to feel, sometimes when I'll give my talk and I'm talking about, I used to say when we make movies for men and when we make movies for women, and a lot of people in the audience would call me on that and say, why can't you just make movies for everybody? Mm-hmm. And that's when I began to say, well, really, it's like when we make a certain movie, we know that 70% of the people who show up are going to be women. We just know that. Yeah. It's just the way it goes. When we make this kind of a movie, we know that 70% of the people who show up are going to be men. We just know that. So it would be foolish for us to ignore that in terms of where we advertise it and everything else. But I do, so I definitely recognize that women can be all kinds of things and men can be all kinds of things. But I just wonder about, I've been re-listening to your book and trying to watch where my thoughts go. And I realize how many of them are about, I might make somebody feel bad that I don't even know.
You mean and then I will had an encounter with someone you don't know well?
For example, I'll tell you, this is a stupid thing, but I just happened to be noticing it because I've been listening to your book. I was at the market. Mm-hmm. I picked up a carton of milk and it was leaking and it got milk on my hand, right? So I looked around for somebody from the dairy department. There wasn't anybody around from the dairy department. So you just
put it back down?
So I didn't put it back with the other milk. But I put it in a different part of the dairy department, hoping that somebody would realize there was something wrong with it. And
but then you worry that some unsuspecting consumer will pick it up.
I'm still thinking about this.
And then that will lead to like their death or something somehow.
No, I know. I'm pretty sure they're not going to die, but I know they're going to have the same uncomfortable feeling that I had, and I still feel guilty about it.
I'm not sure that particular thing I would associate with sex differences so much. I mean, I do like I do a version of that. But no, what I mainly do is more self-centered. Like, does that person think badly of me? I mean, this is the true test. That you are a better person than me. If you're, I feel a little guilty about things where the person who could be harmed by my action is someone I don't even know who they are. I do have a little, but if you're really like plagued by that kind of thing.
I'm not plagued.
And they will not even know that it was you, that you are the culprit.
Right.
Then you are a better person than me. So it's good that you're a Hollywood potentate and I'm not, and you are shaping America's culture and I'm not. That's
shaping
good.
Young minds. Well, I just wonder because there's that thing about being codependent, and you're codependent when you're dying and somebody else's life passes through your mind. And
that's not going to happen with me, believe me.
But I wonder whether that's more of a female thing and whether my worry about the milk carton goes into that I spend when I watch my thoughts, the way your book is teaching me to watch my thoughts, I realize how many of them are like that. I'm not plagued by them. I don't think the person's going to die, but part of my conscious mind is spent wondering, have I done something that's going to make somebody else's life worse? And I feel like one of the things your book has taught me is that doesn't make me a better person, that somehow that's about getting genes into the next generation, that social, that doing, and especially the part of the book that says it used to be that you would know everybody. There wouldn't be anybody
right.
who
would pick up a milk
carton. There would only be somebody you knew, and that therefore you're still operating on this kind of ice age premise that you're going to meet that person around the next corner and they're going to
right. Our brains do seem to have been engineered by natural selection and an environment very different from ours, in which we would have basically pretty much everyone we saw, we were going to see again. So, I mean, for example, a classic is you're walking down the street, you see a homeless person, and you kind of, you don't want to make eye contact if you're not going to give them money. That it's better to avert their, you'll like cross the street to avoid the risk of like making eye contact, right? And when you think about it, it's like, on the one hand, why do I care, in strictly self-serving terms? Why should I care what a homeless person thinks of me? But again, in the environment of our evolution, any needy person would have been someone you were going to encounter who had the capacity to either harm you or to return a favor. So, I do think it's an important thing, to keep in mind. In terms of sex differences, it's funny. We just did a mashup on meaningoflife.tv, a series of mashups, and we'll link to this one. It was about problems people have communicating, or they say they have communicating. And when my daughter watched it, she noticed that more than one person said, my problem is I'm reluctant to like tell somebody I'm not interested in what they're saying or even signal that. And she said, my daughter said, notice that all of those are women. This is like, you know, you don't see the men saying that.
Right.
And some men may have the problem, but they're, yeah, it's, as you know, this is a controversial subject.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And I'm sure it is. It is. But I just wonder whether that, to me, that is kind of codependent behavior. I'm more worried about that person's feelings than I am about mine.
Yeah, it sounds like you have taken it to extremes. My neuroses are much more self-serving in the sense that it's like, is this person thinking badly of me? Is that person thinking badly of me? I do have a conscience in terms of the milk thing. It would go through my mind. I'd try, but I would not be plagued afterwards.
I wasn't plagued, and I think I was particularly aware of it because I was listening to your book on the way to the market, on the way home from the market, and so I was particularly aware of that thought. And as I began to watch my thoughts over the rest of that hour, I began to realize how many of them were making up stories about other people and thinking about their emotions, whether I knew them or not.
Now, do you meditate at all?
No.
Okay, so this is where we move into the conversion part of my program, when we actually convert you. You should try a meditation retreat. I encourage that.
You're not the only person who's told me that.
Yeah. Well, good. You should listen to the people who are telling you that. I'm sure there are plenty in Southern California.
There are plenty.
Yeah.
There are plenty. Somebody I know was just on a silent meditation retreat, and they were outside walking, doing a walking meditation, and somebody was bitten by a rattlesnake. He said that made a big impression on everybody.
What happened to them? They survived, right?
They did. It was a dry bite, which I didn't know about before, and neither did he. That most rattlesnake bites don't have poison in them.
Really?
Yeah, that was news.
Huh.
That was news to me.
Well,
obviously everybody was very upset.
Could be that had the person not been in such a state of bliss, he would have avoided the snake. I don't know.
Possible. It's possible.
So, well, just finally, I mean, I guess we, in a sense, we are where we started. We haven't solved the conundrum, depending on your preference, of the question of why this is this basic thing you called attention to, that people don't accurately remember the end of movies. They very often end with this kind of consolidation after the triumph. But what they remember is the triumph, and so I guess we should invite people to submit their ideas. But you continue to have no satisfactory explanation?
No, I don't really have. I mean, I think we care about people more than we care about winning. I don't know. I mean, I think what's interesting is, we usually advertise those movies in terms of the winning. You advertise it as a boxing movie. You advertise it as a saving the world movie. You advertise it there's a black hole under Brooklyn, and if Miles Morales doesn't do what he needs to do with all these other Spider-Men, the whole universe could collapse. That's what you advertise, but at the same time, you're very careful to show these relationships between people in those ads. And you see when you test the ads how much that can mean, how much a father-son relationship can mean, how much a father-daughter relationship can mean. It's just interesting. You find out that the relationship that matters most while people are watching the movie is the relationship that matters least when you try to advertise the movie. You have to watch the whole movie to care about that.
Right.
You can't come to care about it in 15 seconds.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. It's kind of like selling a book. I mean, what the marketers want to seize on is not actually what you were trying to get across, but.
Right. And you can see that all the time. But I mean, I came up with a thing once where I said, you're better off making a movie that sounds good than a movie that is good. Mm-hmm. Because there are a lot of movies that sound really good, that test very badly. They even have really bad word of mouth, but they just sound so great. You just can't believe they're not going to be good. And so they'll do really well. Right. While a movie that sounds difficult and depressing and like you have to work to watch it, can actually be one of the most entertaining movies that you see all year, but it doesn't sound entertaining. Yeah. And so you don't go. I mean, it was part of the problem with Spinal Tap. It was like it's a band you've never heard of, and everything that happens to them is terrible. And it's a documentary, but you've never seen a documentary in the theaters before. And then we're making fun of documentaries, but you've never seen one. So why would you understand what a parody of one looks like? All of that stuff.
Right.
And it was a very sophisticated movie about an unsophisticated subject.
Right.
That turned out to be not the easiest way to market a movie.
But that movie is so good. And it led to that kind of team stayed together for a number of mockumentaries, right? I don't know. I guess Rob Reiner wasn't involved in all of them.
No, Chris Guest made a lot of documentaries after that. He went on to make several movies and that are very much in that idea, those very deadpan, everybody seems to be in a documentary.
I see, but there wasn't that much continuity between the original cast of the Spinal Tap cast and the other ones?
Not particularly. I mean, I don't, the band did get back together and do a couple of things after that. They would sometimes play together, and there were various things that happened with them, but there wasn't, I don't know, I wasn't part of that group from that point on. I made another movie with Rob Reiner.
You did The Sure Thing?
Yeah, I was.
That was really a nice little.
Isn't that a nice movie?
Yeah,
I love that.
It really is. It's really nice. I think it did pretty well, didn't it?
It did okay. It didn't do great. I think it probably made its money back. It was a disappointment, I think, in terms of.
It reminds me a tiny bit of that Cameron Crowe movie, Say Anything.
Yes, absolutely.
Although it was kind of modeled. Was it modeled after It Happened One Night?
Yes.
It was.
Yes, absolutely. But it was, John Cusack hadn't really been in anything at that point, so he wasn't a known quantity. Daphne News.
Oh, so wait, is he in The Sure Thing?
Yes.
So that's why
that's
one reason I'm connecting the two movies in my mind.
Right, exactly. So there was nowhere, and again, it was interesting. The movie is about, if he goes to California, there's a girl he can automatically sleep with. The first marketing campaign was all about sex. And Rob went, no.
The whole point
that's not what we're doing here at all.
Yeah.
But when it came out on home video, they did a standee of Nicolette Sheridan in her bikini. It was like, we know what we're selling. You guys stay over there. We know what we're doing. So it was, you don't want
it reminds me of book marketing. My philosophy is sell it to the kinds of people who would actually like it.
Right.
It's like, if you have some amazing sales pitch that leads to great first week sales of a book, but none of the people who buy it are going to like it, that's the wrong pitch.
Right. Right. And yet you want to write whatever book you want, don't you? I can.
Oh yeah. You want to write the book, and you want to sell it to people who would like the book you wrote.
Right.
I'm just saying you don't want to maximize first week sales. You want to maximize lifetime sales and actual appreciation. But so final question. I was a little surprised when you said that the Academy Awards are, they tend to go to, I don't know how you put it, like kind of dark films or edgy films. I thought there was also something of a stereotype about the Academy, having in mind the interests of the industry as they choose the films and having a certain gravitation toward the blockbuster. And
that used to be much more true than it is now. When I was growing up and my father was in the Academy, there was this feeling of, he worked for Paramount, so you vote for the Paramount picture. You do what's good for you, and you do what's good for the industry, and you give the awards to things like Oliver, or you give the awards to like Lawrence of Arabia. You give it to big movie, usually a movie that's well received critically, but a great big blockbuster movie. But once in a while, they gave it to The Apartment. You know what I mean? Once in a while, it would be about something else. Now, for whatever reason, and it's because people aren't that loyal to individual studios anymore, and I think people really are paying more attention to the artistry, they'll give it to a movie like Moonlight, or years ago to Annie Hall, which was at that time the lowest grossing movie to win the Academy Award. You really can't tell at all. I mean, Black Panther was an enormous hit.
Right.
And 50 years ago, I think it would have automatically have won the best picture, and it may still, but it isn't automatic the way it used to. It's much more about what did I love and admire this year. When you look at your ballot, that's what you really tend to think of is what did I love and admire.
Well, Can't complain about that as a criterion, I guess. Well, thank you so much, Lindsay.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
We'll link to your TED Talk and to anything else you want us to link to. And encourage people to read up on all the projects you've been associated with.
Okay. Or see them. More importantly, see them.
And now you can.
See Stranger Than Fiction, see Nanny McPhee, see Sense and Sensibility.
Absolutely. They're just a click
Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
right.
Thank you so much.
You. Good to see you.
And we'll see you down the road.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.